Hello, and welcome to History on Blast, episode 30. I've got wood for sheep. I'm Hillary, and I'll be your host, as in this episode, we're putting cattle ranchers on blast for sheep-related crimes, but we're also putting shepherds on blast for fence cutting. But first, this month in history. On Sunday, September 2nd of 1666, the bakery of Thomas Fariner caught fire shortly after midnight. Due to high winds and the indecisiveness of Sir Thomas Bloodworth, the mayor of London, the small blaze turned into a firestorm. Modern estimates for the Great Fire of London's temperatures are between 2,000 to 3,000 degrees Fahrenheit. While a majority of the fire was finally defeated on Wednesday, September 5th, it took until the following March for the embers to stop reigniting parts of the city. To make it all the more wild, this came right on the heels of the last bout of bubonic plague in England, just that summer.
Hey Warren.
Hey Kay.
Did you know that Cats and Les Mis are sung through musicals? And did you know that the musical Guys and Dolls was written by the same guy who wrote Baby It's Cold Outside?
I have no idea what any of those words mean.
Warren, we covered this on Tone Deaf last week.
I don't remember what I had for breakfast last week. You expect me to remember musicals last week?
Listen to Tone Deaf, a theater nerd's guide for their musically challenged spouse, and expand your knowledge of musical theater.
Or just laugh as I struggle to remember that one show about the Cobras.
I still have no idea what you're talking about.
Tune in every Wednesday to Tone Deaf.
Alright, so before I really jump into the Sheep Wars, which is not an exciting new retelling of Star Wars, but with sheep, that would be fantastic and so much less ridiculous than what it actually is. I'd like to thank Kay from the Tone Deaf podcast for the suggestion of this episode topic, because this is actually the basic premise behind the musical Oklahoma. Yes, Oklahoma, where the wind comes sweeping down the plain, that Oklahoma. So there's a scene in the course of the musical where they sing the song The Farmer and the Cowman, which is sort of at a dance, and it's kind of a fun time. They're trying to convince the cowboys and the farmers that they should get along, and they refuse, and then an old woman points a gun at them until they all sing. Which is exactly how the Wild West worked. Only not. Really, if Aunt Eller had existed in the actual Wild West, maybe things would have gone more smoothly. Another important thing that I really want to impress upon you before we go delving deep into the Sheep Wars is that as much as the image that this conjures to the mind is cowboys running around in the 1800s with horses and everything, the Sheep Wars didn't actually end until the 1920s, which is both hilarious and horrifying, and also means that there were absolutely people killing each other over sheep at the same time that, like, we had mobster activity, which is fantastic. So, the Sheep Wars primarily took place in the states of Texas, Arizona, Colorado, and Wyoming. There were approximately 120 incidents all total, which left 54 people dead and anywhere between 50,000 and 100,000 sheep dead. Yeah, Sheep Wars. We weren't kidding. This is a war over sheep. So it starts in the 1870s. Cattle ranching is extremely well established, particularly in Texas, where our story begins. And then we start having shepherds showing up in these territories. Prior to that, there were really only the cattle ranchers, and they were putting up fences as a means of keeping their cows, in a particular area. They'd move them around and they would have cattle runs and things like that. But for the most part, they were putting out large swaths of fencing and keeping the cattle actually safe from cattle rustlers, because that's the biggest thing you had to worry about as a cattle rancher, is people coming along and stealing your cows, which is it's a historical major problem when it comes to cows. See also the cattle raid of Cooley, which is something I will talk about in a totally different episode probably. So the other thing that these fences did is they kept other livestock away from these herds of cattle, because there was a very common parasite, a form of mange known as sheep scab, that was being passed from the sheep to the cattle. And if the cattle got this sheep scab mange parasite, they lost all of their value immediately. They were no longer useful for leather. They were no longer useful for food. Nothing. They are now, horribly sick animals who serve absolutely no monetary purpose. So, what's a shepherd to do when you can't move your sheep across the land? Cut the fences, of course! Now, this begins a period called the Fence-Cutting Wars, which is, aptly named, as is really all of this. So, it is literally what it says on the tin. People were going around cutting the fences on this cattle ranching territory and then moving their sheep through it. Now, part of the reason this was such a big deal, because, they say it right in the musical, the farmer and the cowman should be friends. So why not? The answer is racism. Also sheep disease, but mostly racism. Because the cattle ranchers were largely white American citizens from the East who had moved west and are now raising cattle and had ties to government officials and the court system. And they were getting laws passed on their behalf to protect the cattle. And the shepherds, for the most part, were of Native American or Hispanic descent and didn't have the same kind of backing from the local governments or the law in order to protect their sheep and their livelihood. By the 1880s, Texas starts passing laws which are meant to put into place sheep inspectors so that they can quarantine sheep with scab to keep them from grazing in public land, to make sure that shepherds had to be able to present a certificate showing that their sheep had been inspected in order to cross counties, not even state lines, county lines. Now, where this becomes a problem is that the General Land Office in Texas didn't actually have the necessary people. There was no representative to do this. So there was no one enforcing any of it. And the last major law passed in Texas related to this is in 1884. They make the cutting of fences a felony. Let that sink in for a minute. Then we move on to Arizona and the Pleasant Valley War. This one gets a little bit more specific. This is when we start seeing deaths. Not to say that people weren't killing each other in Texas, but I actually have names in Arizona. So the Tewksbury family and the Graham family were both ranching families. They were both cattle ranchers. But the difference is the Tewksburys, I guess, had a little song and dance with Aunt Eller because they were getting along with these shepherds and they were supporting them, allowing them on their land and all of that, starting in 1885 when they arrive in Arizona. This ended up upsetting the other cattle ranchers in the area because now you have all of the sheep problems that were happening in Texas, but with a rancher on their side instead of just trying to prevent the shepherds from moving in. So they decided to pass a law in 1886 to make it illegal for shepherds to move their flocks within 2 miles of cattle grazing land. They established a specific place called the Mogollon Rim. I'm almost definitely pronouncing that wrong. I'm betting that it's probably Spanish, and I don't know how to pronounce Spanish, and I'm sorry. But they decided to establish this place as the official border that sheep could not pass. But the Tewksbury's and the Daggs brothers both lived in the Pleasant Valley, south of the border of that territory, and they allowed sheep on their lands. So the ranchers decided to take this as an excuse to escalate a feud that had been going since 1882. But first blood wasn't spilled until 1885 when a shepherd for the Daggs was killed by a man named Andy Cooper, who was a rancher siding with the Grahams. Another was killed in 1887. He was actually beheaded 2 miles north of the Graham Ranch. There was eventually, this all escalated into an actual gunfight at the Middleton Ranch on August 9th, 1887. That's right, people are actually having a straight up shootout at a ranch over sheep. At the end of that, 2 men were dead, another 2 were wounded, and then it escalates into a bunch of revenge killings and stops being so much about sheep because, revenge killings are a thing. But by the time it ends in 1892, 25 people are dead, including all of the Graham men and most of the Tewksburys. Then this is where things start getting. So 1884 is when things in my thoughts really get ridiculous. Like prior to that, okay, yeah, people are shooting at each other and they're killing each other and they're beheading each other, and that's really awful, and I'm not condoning that behavior, but then they just go full-blown cuckoo for Cocoa Puffs and start doing things like tying cowbells to wild horses and driving them at herds of sheep. And then cowboys drove over 4,000 sheep into the Little Colorado River, where some of them died in the quicksand. Which, by the way, there's quicksand in the Little Colorado River. Which is probably one of the first times I've ever heard of quicksand existing in real life. And they herded sheep into it. So now we're going to move on to Wyoming and Colorado. So between 1870 and 1909, there were 24 attacks, leading to 6 deaths, although some reports say up to 16 deaths, and it's a little ambiguous which one is correct, because you can find both. In 1894, 3,800 sheep were driven over cliffs in Colorado, and the shepherd Carl Brown was shot in the hip. Later that same year, in the same county, another 1,500 sheep were killed in the same way, which really is an astounding number of sheep. And, they're just killing sheep at this point. That's more or less the rest of the story, is they just keep killing sheep for a while. And, there's more of it. I have pages and pages of sheep murder in Wyoming and Colorado, with masked cowboys killing shepherds, and hundreds of sheep, and it just keeps going until finally we get to the last 3 raids in 1911, 1912, and 1920. No more shepherds were killed during these raids, And the wars finally came to an end with the Taylor Grazing Act of 1934, and this is when they changed the ranching practices. And things became much more, friendly between the cattle ranchers and the shepherds. And we finally have that moment from the musical where everybody's happy and dancing together. And yeah, that's more or less the story. In conclusion, I guess don't cut fences because your neighbor will murder all of your sheep and then cut your head off. As always, thank you for listening. If you have any comments, questions, feedback, suggestions, really anything at all, feel free to send them my way either on Twitter at historyonblast or at historyonblast@gmail.com. You can also find us on Facebook at the History on Blast discussion group. I definitely recommend checking that out. We've had some really great conversations up there that have led to a lot of episodes. So if you want input on the episode decision-making process and what things we're going to talk about here in the future, definitely check that out. You can also find us on Patreon at History on Blast. Things are a little behind there, but I do expect to be getting some new Patreon episodes up this month. I'm going to make up for the missing episodes as well. So with any luck, the next couple months, there should be double episodes until we're back up to the right number. I'd also like to thank Defy Them All for the use of their song Keeper of Histories for the intro and outro of our program. And as always, thank you.